Principles and Elements of Design, Part 3. Integration, Dominance, and the Elements of Design. I'm Charles Bernard. These three qualities, feeling, instinct, and sensitivity, are vital to the creative artist. Are you a creative artist? You need to be a creative artist to produce the kind of work that people are going to get excited about seeing. You need to present reality in a different way. People need to see it in a fresh and new and original way, and that is not easy to do. Bernie Fuchs, the great artist, as well as Bob Peak, are just a couple of great artists that were able to do this. So it's important that you study their work to see how they translated reality into a more imaginative reality than what was before them. The idea is not to present a literal rendition of reality, but an imaginative one. The sky area I made green, which relates closely to the blue-green. It's right next to the blue-green on the colored circle. I got rid of the clouds and the dragon in the sky. They were just cluttering up the picture. It's very important that you don't clutter the picture. Put only into the picture what is needed to tell the story. No more, no less. Otherwise, it's going to clutter the picture. Keep things simple. Now, there's nothing in the sky to distract the attention away from the figures. I made a change over here to reflect more of what is going on in my rough sketch. And here you can see that I added this blue-green background to indicate dominance of the blue-green color over all the other colors. And then I added the yellow-green sky, which you see in my sketch, and this little red accent, which you see right there, drawing attention to the man's head, because it's placed right next to the head. If I place that accent down here somewhere, it would draw too much attention down here. So it's placed at the head to draw attention to the head. And it helps to add a certain amount of vitality to the picture. It adds interest as well. Take a look over here. If I remove that little red discord accent, you see it's not as interesting as when that little red accent is there. And it draws the attention to that red color. Now this little discord is integrated with the other colors by way of giving that red accent a similar intensity of color to the other colors, thereby integrating it with the other colors. This is another way in which you can further integrate an element by having the intensity of its color similar to the intensity of the other colors. And if you look over here in my rough sketch, you can see that that red accent is not very bright. I didn't make it like this. That would draw too much attention to the accent and distract the attention from the rest of the picture. So therefore, it needs to be kept low in intensity like this, not only to prevent it from acquiring too much attention, but so that it also integrates with the low intensity of the other colors. Take a look again over here. If I make that little red accent really bright, now the intensity of that color no longer integrates with the intensity of the other colors. The other colors are more grayed, while this one is much brighter, more intense, and therefore it doesn't integrate with those other colors in terms of its intensity. But by making the color more gray like that, a grayed red, it now integrates with the other lower intensity colors. Watch what happens when I change the color of this small triangle. It's still blue-green, but now it's a bright blue-green. However, even though it is a much brighter blue-green than the blue-green of a large triangle, it still integrates with the large triangle, because both shapes are triangles, both shapes are blue-green. So, therefore, the intensity of the color can be much brighter and still integrate with the larger triangle. But if the shape is different, if it contrasts strongly with the dominant shape, and you add a bright color, and the dominant shape is not a bright color, then it won't integrate with that larger shape. Not in terms of its intensity. It may integrate with other properties, such as value and size, for example, and similarity of color, or the same color, or its texture, or direction, or the line that it has, but it won't integrate in terms of intensity of color. The blue contrasting rectangle shape in the abstraction diagram integrates with the other colors, not only by the properties that I mentioned earlier that are repeated in those other shapes, but also because of its low intensity of color, which is similar to the lower intensity of color in the other shapes. And this further helps to create a strong alliance between the contrasting rectangle shape with the other shapes. If that color were a bright color like this, now that rectangle no longer has the strong alliance with the other colors and shapes that it had before, because now I've taken away one of the important properties that helps to integrate it with the other colors and shapes. See, now that the blue color has been returned to its lower intensity, it forms a much stronger bond with the other colors of lower intensity. Getting back to this bright color for a moment, just want to point out to you that in my rough sketch, you see that bright color right there. So you see, this idea that I'm showing you here has been applied to my rough color sketch. I can add that bright blue-green there because of what I explained to you here. The shapes here all have that angular or triangular appearance, just as these two shapes have a triangular appearance to them. And therefore, you can do what I explained to you here. However, remember, when you add an intense color or a bright color to a strong contrasting shape like this rectangle here, and the other colors are gray colors, then that bright color of that contrasting shape will not integrate with the other colors in terms of its intensity of color. It may integrate with some other properties, but not with intensity of color. And therefore, you weaken the alliance formed between the contrasting shape and its color with the other shapes and colors within the picture. The alliance will not be as strong. The more properties you can repeat, the stronger the alliance, which results in a strong integrated whole, which means that there is unity. The whole picture, therefore, holds together, doesn't fly apart. Watch what happens when I add bright colors to the other shapes. And let's say a yellow here. So these are the primary colors, as you probably know. Red, yellow, and blue. And you can see how garish these colors appear. They are not integrated. They do not form a union. There is no alliance between these colors. But by reducing their intensity, and the yellow, let me pick that up, like this, and then the blue, reduce that intensity. That's a little too much. Like that. Now these strong contrasting colors appear more harmonious. They seem to go together now, whereas before they didn't. They now have been integrated by way of the reduction in the intensity of the colors. But by having them all bright colors, they were all competing with each other for attention. There was no harmony. There was just strong contrast. But now that has changed, and there appears a rather pleasant relationship between them, even though they contrast in hue. So this is how you can bring strong contrasting colors into a more harmonious relationship with each other. This whole abstraction is harmonious because all these colors are reduced in their intensity. As soon as I add a really bright color, and let's say I add it here, while that rectangle now integrates more strongly with the red dominant triangle, because they both have the same hue and color, that red now disrupts the entire harmony that existed there before. It's out of place. It doesn't belong here because it doesn't have a similar intensity of color like the others do. So this sort of thing you have to avoid. Otherwise, you'll disrupt the harmony. But rules can be broken if you have a good reason for it. You can do this sort of thing. But remember, if you do, you're going to disrupt the overall harmony created. And this sort of strong intensity will draw the eye of the viewer immediately to it. And it'll probably create a spot on which the viewer is going to be riveted and will have a tough time trying to move away from that spot to the rest of the picture. This creates too much of a dominance. That is, too much of strong color contrast for the eye to be able to get away from this and then wander off to other parts of the picture. But now, you see, there isn't any bright color that draws your attention so strongly to it that it would disrupt the harmony of the whole and then cause the eye of the viewer to just get fixed on that one spot and not be able to move away to other parts of the picture. This pertains to the center of interest. The center of interest should be emphasized in a more subtle way. If you place too much contrast there, if the contrast is too strong, then the eye is going to get fixed in one spot and not be able to move away, like I mentioned here, to other parts of the picture. So let's say, for example, I change this part of his costume here to a red, like this. And I add a bright red here. You can see that that bright red, that very intense red, is out of harmony with the rest of the colors, which are more grayed, of lower intensity. You can see how the eye is now fixated on this spot and is prevented from easily moving to other parts of the picture, circulating around the picture. Now, the eye is riveted here because the contrast is too great. That's why you have to be careful when you add contrast to the center of interest in order to emphasize it. Don't make it too strong. In other words, the dominance that you create at the center of interest through contrast, dominance is also achieved not only through size and through repetition or through establishing more of one kind of shape or one kind of color and so forth than another, but also through strength of contrast. When something contrasts strongly, it draws attention. It becomes dominant. And in this case, when you add that much contrast, you're adding too much dominance. It becomes too dominant. Unless you have other bright colors in the picture, and then that one bright color like this won't rivet the eye on that one spot. You'll be moving to the other bright colors within the picture. So what needs to be done in this example, of course, is to reduce the intensity like this, so that the intensity of this color matches more the intensity of the other colors in the picture. And how low you need to go with this intensity is a matter of judgment. You have to see if that color harmonizes with the other colors in terms of its intensity. Now you see that that red no longer attracts as much attention as it did before. And could reduce the intensity even more, like this. Still attracts the eye, but no longer as strong as before, and the eye isn't riveted to that one spot like it was before. This red becomes a discord color accent. And when you have just one color like this that acts as an accent, that can give a lot of impact to a picture. However, it's usually best to also repeat that color somewhere else, to echo it somewhere else, which means to repeat it with some variation. And the reason for that is because when you just have one color like I do here, which is not repeated anywhere else in the picture, that one color becomes isolated and really doesn't form a union with the rest of the picture because it doesn't relate to another red. You have a blue, then it needs to relate to another blue if there is no other blue in the entire picture. So it's best to repeat the color so that it has another color to relate to. Therefore, it doesn't become isolated from the rest of the picture. But here again is an example where you can break the rules. If you have a good reason for it, you can just add one color accent, and that color doesn't have to appear anywhere else in the picture. And like I said, it can provide a lot of impact to a picture. What I think I'm going to do is repeat or echo that red in his hands, so that the hands have more of a flesh color, like this. The very subtle indication of the red here in the hands, and then maybe a little bit in his face, where his cheek is, like that. So I'm echoing the red, not repeating it exactly the way it appears right there. And I think I'll add a little bit of red to the knife that that other figure is holding. Just a little spot like that, that's enough. That helps to draw the eye back to where that other figure is. And it also helps to add a little bit more color variety back here, more interest through color variety, by adding that little red accent. So remember what I have shown you about bright colors or intense colors. Matter of fact, in a low-key painting like this, be sure you don't add bright colors to places within the painting where you don't want the eye to go. So if I add a bright blue here, you see how that bright blue draws your attention to it immediately? It disrupts the harmony of these lower intensity colors here. And the eye is then taken away from parts of the picture that are more important. And the eye is prevented from easily moving to other parts of the picture because that bright color is drawing too much attention. It disrupts the harmony of color elsewhere because it doesn't belong, it doesn't fit in with the rest of the colors. even with, let's say, a white. You put a white someplace, like on this sword here. You see how it draws the attention to the sword immediately? It disrupts the eye from moving to other parts of the picture easily because the eye remains focused here. That becomes too distracting, just like this bright color becomes too distracting. While there is an alliance between these different or contrasting colors because of the similarity of intensity, as I mentioned, this alliance can be strengthened by having an additional element of design such as value in alliance with these colors as well. Here are the colors seen in black and white. Those values that are the same or very similar, such as the value of the background color and this rectangle, as well as this triangle here, these colors form an alliance by way of value as well as intensity of color. So there's a strong alliance because of this double alliance that occurs. Double alliance, value and intensity of color. However, the value of the rectangle here as well as the background and this triangle here are not similar to the value of this large triangle, and therefore there is no strong alliance in terms of value with that large triangle. The large triangle, however, forms an alliance with the color of the background. And here are the colors again. The red of the large triangle forms an alliance with the green of the background. Even though they are different colors, they form the alliance because of a similar low intensity of color as well as a similar value. And the circle here also forms an alliance with the large triangle as well as this background color because it has the same value as those other shapes. Because all these shapes form an alliance with other shapes, there are no isolated shapes or colors. And that's a requirement of good design. If you have something that is isolated within your picture, it's going to look like it doesn't belong there. It's going to look out of place. And therefore, it shouldn't be in the picture. The picture or design needs to form one unit, a unified unit. And that can only be achieved when all of the parts have been integrated into a unified and harmonious whole, as I've been showing you. If I added, let's say, a white right here like that. Now that is a very strong value contrast. It contrasts strongly with the other values around it because it's so different from those other values. Now this circle shape has become an isolated shape. It doesn't form an alliance with any of the other shapes or colors. And that's something that should be avoided. But as I mentioned before, the rules can be broken if you have a good reason for it. And this circle shape, being isolated the way it is, becomes a discord. And sometimes you may want a discord like that. You want something to disrupt the whole. But remember that you're treading on dangerous ground when you do this, because it could destroy the overall harmony and unity of the composition. Now, what can be done to prevent this discord from appearing isolated? Well, it's really a simple matter of repeating the value. So if I make this triangle down here a white, that white circle is no longer isolated. It now relates to the triangle because the two have something in common. They're both white. So to prevent isolation from occurring, you always need to relate one element of design to another, like one white value to another white value, or one circle to another circle. And that will prevent that shape from appearing isolated, and it will become part of the greater whole, even though you've only repeated the value or the shape once. That's all it really takes. Now, there are two white values instead of one, so there isn't any isolation. I could do the same, for example, with black. I'll make this rectangle black. It now is isolated from the rest of the design. It is a discord, just as the white circle was a discord. And in order to prevent that black from appearing isolated, I need to repeat it in another shape, and I'll repeat it here in this smaller triangle. Now the black is no longer isolated. And of course, the same idea applies to color. To prevent color from appearing isolated, color must be repeated, just as I repeated the red of the circle within the red of the triangle, thereby preventing the red circle from appearing isolated and the red triangle from appearing. You understand what I've been showing you here? That idea was, of course, applied to my rough sketch here, where this part of his costume was repeated over here on the knife. Even just a small repetition of the red like this is enough to keep this larger red from appearing isolated. To thoroughly understand what I've been showing you here, it's essential that you do a lot of practice work, trying to apply what I've shown you to your own work. If you don't do a lot of practice work with a lot of conscious effort to try to get these principles into your own work, you're going to forget them. They won't become part of your memory, they won't enter into your work, and you'll be left with bad art. This is of the greatest importance, because if you don't apply what I've shown you here, you're not going to be able to produce anything really good or great. All great artists, all good artists, all artists who know what they're doing, know what I have shown you here. It's in their work. This has been known for hundreds of years by artists who really know what they're doing. This isn't something that was just invented. This has been around a long time, and it makes the crucial difference between a bad work of art and a great one. There are many more things that I could do with this rough color sketch. It is, after all, just a rough color sketch. I'm going to give you the definition of what design is. Later, I'll give you the definition of what composition is. I think it needs to be made clear precisely what is meant by design. Design is the art of relating or unifying contrasting elements, such as you see here. It is man-made order. It is structure, it is composition, and it is organization and form. It is the art of creating interesting units. Unity, harmony, contrast, gradation, repetition, balance, dominance, and alternation. These are the principles of design, and they are derived from nature. They can be found in the things that live and grow. Design is also pattern and rhythm, and involves shape and space as well. I should, however, mention that there are as many kinds of design as there are interpretations of the word, and any or all of them may be of interest to the artist. The artist's chief concern, however, is with the particular principles of design that apply to making pictures. And it is these principles that I have been showing you throughout the Art Trek video series. Design is the single most important ingredient in a successful picture. It is what the viewer will respond to most strongly. It is what will give your painting that wow factor. It is what will dazzle the viewer. It is what you will respond to most favorably. In effect, it is design that makes the picture. Of course, there are other ingredients to a successful picture that need to be understood and applied. But design is the single factor that will give your paintings that visual punch, that wow factor. The great illustrator Bob Peak, he was a genius at design. I don't think anybody would disagree with that after seeing his work. His paintings are primarily so visually powerful because of their design. That's what holds your attention so that you can't look away because they are visually so interesting. If you've never heard of Bob Peak and would like to see his illustrations, you might want to check out his website at www.bobpeak.com. I had the good fortune of meeting Bob Peak once when I was working at the famous artist schools in Westport, Connecticut. He was one of the guiding faculty members there, and I'll always remember that meeting. The art director there that I was working for at the time introduced me to Bob Peak. Bob Peak came into my office, and I had an illustration by the great Robert Heindel hanging on my wall. But at that time, Robert Heindel wasn't famous. And I remember that that illustration on the wall caught Bob Peak's eye immediately. Bob Peak asked me who the artist was who did that illustration. And I told him that it was Robert Heindel. And Bob Peak said that that illustration showed someone who really understood his craft. A really well done illustration. And then some years later, Robert Heindel became famous. So you see, Bob Peak immediately could recognize true talent when he saw it. I thought you might be interested in hearing that little story, but now let's get back to design. These two contrasting units that you see here, they contrast in many different ways: color, size, shape, and so on. Design is the way through which opposing units like this can be unified. And if you've been following the Art Trek video series, then you should know by now how these two opposing units can be unified. And if you don't know how to unify these two units, well, then how do you expect to unify an entire painting? Becoming an artist is not easy. I've mentioned this before. Anything that can be easily achieved without much effort isn't worth achieving to begin with, as far as I'm concerned. Now, before I move on to the definition of composition, I would like to say that good design always involves the exclusion of every unessential element, which means anything that is superfluous, unnecessary, anything that is really not needed, that will not make an important contribution to the picture, should be left out. And now I'm going to move on to composition. Composition. From the practical point of view of the artist, composition consists of applying his or her sense and understanding of design to the harmonious arrangement of all of the elements in the picture. Composition is the means through which we can say what we have in mind with clarity to the viewer. It is the architecture and structure of picture making, and includes design. Design and composition go hand in hand. Here you see the four main elements that composition can be divided into, and that composition is concerned with. Position, which means where you place your shapes and forms within the picture area. And the picture area is the format shape, the size and shape of the two-dimensional surface on which you will place your shapes and forms. Position isn't just where you place the subject, here or down here, but it also involves how close are you going to be to the subject. Is the subject going to be large in size, which means you are close to the subject? Or will the subject be farther away, which will make it smaller? So size is also involved in this placement of your subject. Composition involves the arrangement of shapes within your picture area. Next is depth. And here is an example of depth that has been created by making the foreground spacecraft larger than the one in the distance and placing the one in the distance further up in the picture area. Also contributes to a feeling of depth. Composition also creates a form through the arrangement of the shapes and forms. So composition is referred to as form and also as structure or organization. It is organization because when you are creating a composition, you are establishing order with the elements within your picture. The last element of design is referred to as leading lines because these lines lead the eye of the viewer throughout the composition, such as you see here. The line is a line that is created by way of the elements of design, such as shape, line, value, color, direction, texture, and size, for example. And they establish an abstract movement, a compositional movement, which is an abstract movement within the picture that moves the eye throughout the picture. It is not the kind of line like this, for example, that is created with a pencil, a thin line like that. This is an abstract line, a movement which is referred to as a line established by the elements of design. The eye will follow a repeated shape or value, such as you see here, thereby setting up a movement around like that in this case. A rhythm has been established by repeating this shape and this value, and rhythm creates a compositional movement, a leading line that the eye follows. There are three kinds of line used in composition. One is called the psychological sight line, and that means that the eye of the viewer will look in the direction that your character is looking. The other is an implied direction. The other kind of line is a kind of line that is created through repetition. When you repeat a color or a value or a shape, such as in this example, the eye will follow that repetition from one shape to the next to the next, if those shapes are similar looking or the same, such as in this case. Also, a tonal gradation running from dark to a lighter value, such as this, for example. The eye will follow that gradation from dark to light. A compositional line will also be created by a two-dimensional or a three-dimensional tonal mass, along which the eye will move, such as in this example here, where the eye moves around this dark tonal mass. And another compositional line is created by the contour of a shape that the eye will follow, like you see here. I talked about this kind of compositional line in one of my first videos in the Art Direct video series. You might remember seeing that, or if you didn't get a chance to see it, you might want to check it out. Composition holds your subject matter together. It is a structure of shapes and total values that is usually as logical and functional as the structure of a building, a bridge, or any other product of good design. I should also mention that the structure and rhythm of shapes, as well as the total values and the colors, is what constitutes composition. Good pictures simply don't just happen by accident. They are the result of knowledge, understanding, intelligence, creativity, imagination, sensitivity. All of those qualities and more are embodied within the picture. That's what gives it its value. And if those things are not there, then the picture has no value.
More complicated things cannot be understood unless they are understood in a more simple way first. Therefore, I'm not going to show you complicated paintings at this time, but rather explain these principles of design and elements of design in very simple, rough, abstract terms first, by doing quick, rough sketches. Now I want to say some things about the elements of design. Starting with line, for example, there are only two kinds of line, the straight line and the curve. All lines, no matter how complicated they may appear, are made up of either straight lines or curves or a combination of both. Lines are very easy to recognize. You can't make a mistake in identifying that which looks like a line. If it looks like a line, then that's what it is. And I'll just do a quick rough sketch down here like this of some mountain peaks. And to these straight lines, I'm going to add some curves. So this little rough sketch here has a combination of both straight and curved lines. Now, it's the straight lines that dominate because there are more of them than there are curves. Moving on now to texture. And there are four basic textures. Here they are. There's the soft texture of fur, for example, or water, or a cloud. And texture becomes recognizable at its contour. So, for example, with this soft fur texture, making the contour soft like that with these little hairs coming up helps to identify the soft texture. So it's very important that you get the contour right, or the edge of the shape correct. Otherwise, it'll be more difficult to recognize what the texture is. Now, there's also hard texture, as seen here by these rocks. Then there is the rough texture seen here in the bark of the tree. And last is this smooth texture of this metal box. Take a look at this edge of the rock right there. See how hard that edge is? It's not a soft edge like the edge here for the fur of the kitten. So that hard edge right there helps to identify this texture as being a hard texture. And a rough texture, like the bark of the tree, will have an irregularity to its contour, something like this, that makes it look rough. To these textures, an additional texture could be added. For example, when it rains and things get wet, and you're painting something that needs to look wet, then you're adding a texture to the object so that it looks wet. So that additional texture is a texture that appears wet looking, such as these water drops here. They look wet. Time to move on to the next element of design that I want to talk about, which is color. There are only three basic or primary colors from which all other colors are mixed, and they are yellow, blue, and red. Any color that you can think of, you can get by mixing these colors together. They are the colors for pigment or paint. They are not the primary colors for light. The primary colors for light are different. These are called the primary colors, as I said. And then when you mix these together, such as the yellow and the blue, for example, you get green. When you mix red and blue together, you get violet. And when you mix yellow and red together, you get orange. And those colors are the secondary colors, as they're referred to. So now there's a total of 6 colors. As you can see, I spaced the colors out somewhat in order to make room for additional colors. These additional ones are called the tertiary colors because they are mixed with the secondary colors, which, as you know, are these, with the primary colors. So if I mix yellow and green together, I get yellow-green. Next, when I mix the secondary green with the primary blue, I get blue-green. Then when I mix the primary blue with the secondary violet, I get blue-violet. A little more blue needs to be added. And I think even more. I have to get it just right. Like that. Next, mixing the primary of red with the secondary violet color gives me red-violet. Then mixing the primary red with the secondary orange gives me red-orange. Too much orange there. I need to add more red. Like that. And then when I mix the secondary orange with the primary yellow, I get yellow-orange. Now I have a total of 12 colors for this color wheel. And those are the colors that I'll be showing you throughout the course for the lessons on color. This is the color wheel that you'll be working with. You should memorize this color wheel. It's very important, and it will help you to find the correct color scheme that your picture will need. The next element of design is size. Now, size is simply how large or how small an object is in your picture. Objects that are similar in size, like these two circles, are in harmony. Objects that are very dissimilar in size, like this, are contrasting in size with each other. You need a variety of different sizes within your picture, and a good way to think about what the sizes should be is in terms of a large size, a medium size, and a small size. This will enable you to get variety of sizes into your compositions, which will in turn add a tremendous amount of interest to them. If you have sizes that are too much the same, too similar looking, it's not going to be very interesting. So you need large sizes, middle sizes, and small sizes, basically. And so let's say there's this skyscraper here. And then down here, draw this over like that. There are cars. So I have this huge size and then these smaller sizes. And then I can have another size that's a middle size. These clouds. And then some other buildings that are not quite as tall as that first one is. So I have a variety of sizes here. This adds interest. And a few birds, maybe. Different sizes. So this is what you need to aim for, this kind of variety of different sizes. Now I'd like to talk about the element of design called direction. There are basically four kinds of direction. There's the vertical direction. There's the oblique direction. There's the horizontal direction. And then there's the circular direction. When you begin to plan a composition, always think about which of these four directions is going to be dominant. And dominance, of course, if you look up here, is one of the principles of design. So I want to do this rough sketch of a castle. Now, I have in mind that it is the vertical that I want to dominate in terms of direction. So I begin my sketch with a format shape, or the shape that the picture is going to take, which has a vertical direction to it, like this. And the castle that I'm going to draw, or paint, I'm going to start drawing it, and then I'll paint it. That castle is going to repeat that vertical direction of this format shape, as it's called. So I'm just roughly going to sketch in the castle here, and then I'll jump ahead and show you the rough painting of this castle. So now I'll jump ahead, and here's the finished rough color sketch, and you can immediately see that it has this dominant vertical direction to it. All of these towers that you see have this long shape to it, pointing upward and thereby establishing a dominant vertical direction. Even the side of the wall here has a vertical direction to it, as well as this ladder that appears here. Now, when you have a dominant direction, it needs to be relieved by a different direction, a subordinate direction to the dominant direction, and therefore I've introduced a horizontal direction, which can be seen right there. You see that horizontal direction? As well as right there, that appears horizontal. This part of the wall appears horizontal. Right down here, that line is horizontal. Then there's a horizontal here, and here, and here, and here. And right there, even that little line needs to be counted. Then, in addition to this horizontal direction, I've added another direction, which is the oblique direction, which can be seen right there. As well as down here. There's an oblique direction there, and an oblique direction here, as well as right there, and there, and there, and right here. Even though these directions are very small, they need to be counted. They are important because they provide the needed contrast of direction to the dominant direction. And contrast is another principle of design that you see right there. It's very important. It adds excitement and interest to a picture when you add contrast. And there's another horizontal direction right there where this little figure is standing. And that little figure is actually the center of interest. Center of interest is the most important part of a picture. And even though he's small, your attention is directed to him. And there's a diagonal right there, or a oblique, as it's also referred to. Diagonal and oblique mean the same thing. So, the longer dimension of a shape, such as, let's say, this lighthouse here. Just a real rough, quick suggestion here of a lighthouse. The longer dimension, which is this, as opposed to the width of the shape, determines the direction of the shape, which in this case, of course, is a vertical direction, as opposed to a horizontal direction. What I'm going to do now is take this figure here and move it up into this little drawing. Then reduce the size somewhat. And now you can see that there are basically two directions. The vertical direction of the figure and the horizontal direction of the mountain and the ground, as well as the shape of the sky that I didn't mention yet. So the background shapes have a horizontal direction, while the foreground figure shape has a vertical direction. So there are two opposing directions within this little drawing. However, it is the horizontal direction that is dominant. You always need to establish one dominant direction within your compositions. When there are more of one kind of direction than another, such as I just showed you in this little sketch here, where there are more horizontal directions than vertical directions, that direction then becomes dominant. Also, in addition to the repetition of a direction, the longest dimension of a shape establishes dominance. This can be seen here in this rough sketch of the lighthouse. As I mentioned, the longest dimension of this lighthouse shape is the vertical direction, and therefore the vertical is dominant in this sketch. And I can strengthen that vertical direction by, let's say, adding another shape back here that repeats this vertical direction. Some kind of structure back here, like that. So that shape has a long vertical direction like that, and a shorter horizontal direction. Therefore, it's the vertical direction that is stronger and dominates over the width of that shape and repeats the vertical direction of the lighthouse. Thereby, I'm achieving dominance not only by way of the longer dimension of a shape, but also by repeating that vertical direction in this shape back here. So it strengthens the vertical direction and makes it appear even more dominant. Now, moving on to the last element of design, which is value. Value is simply how light or how dark an object is. And there are ranges of value. There are dark values, lighter values, and very light values. There's a value scale that the artist uses, and it limits the number of values used. And I'll show you what that looks like. Here it is. The artist uses 9 values. Now, moving on to the next element of design, which is value. Value is simply how light or how dark a shape is, or an object. And there are very dark values, then there are lighter values, and then there are the lightest values. The artist limits himself to 9 values. There are many more values in nature, but to use more than 9 values, then you run into problems because things start looking too confusing. Therefore, you need to simplify the number of values that you work with. And the artist works with 9 values that you see here, the 9-value scale. And you can see that the values run from a white all the way down to a black. And they grade downwards, getting darker and darker as they move down to black. The artist doesn't necessarily use all 9 values, although you can. Some of the best pictures have been painted with fewer than 9 values, although if you want a more realistic appearance in which there are a greater number of variations of value, a greater number of nuances of value, then all 9 values can be used, and you'll get a richer, more realistic appearance. But as I said, that doesn't mean that you need to use all 9 values. You can use fewer and still get realistic looking images. A value is a particular tone on the value scale. So let's say I refer to a middle value, this one right here. That would be a middle tone. Or you can just refer to it as a middle value also. Either name can be used to describe the same value, a middle value or a middle tone. But usually, as I said, when you're talking about a value, you're talking about a particular tone on the value scale. When you're working with values, creating value patterns, you'll be working within value ranges, and I've outlined those value ranges here. There is the light value range that you see here. Then there is the middle value range. And then there is the dark value range. Sometimes, however, these value ranges overlap, which means that the light value range can extend further down like that into the next value, and the middle value range can extend up into the light value range like that, and down into the dark value range. And the dark value range can extend up one value like that into the middle range. But then you're treading on dangerous ground, because then you're in danger of breaking up the various value patterns, which are composed of these different value ranges. And I'll be getting into that in later lessons to make it clear to you as to what I'm talking about. But for now, I just want to point this out to you, that when I say a picture has a light and a dark and a middle value, I'm not referring to just one value on the value scale. I'm referring to a range of values that are light or middle value or that are darks. The fewer values you use in a picture, the more abstract the shapes are going to look. To get the shapes to look more realistic, to have them appear three-dimensional, then you need to add additional values to give those shapes some modeling, which gives them a three-dimensional solid appearance. But if you don't want that kind of realistic look, then you use fewer values and your work will begin to look more abstract. To give you an example of what I mean by a value pattern that is made up of value ranges, I'll do a quick rough sketch here. When an artist talks about a value pattern, for example, that he refers to as a dark and middle value against a light, it sounds like the artist is talking about one dark value, one middle value, and one light value. That's not the case. The artist is talking about a range of dark values, a range of middle values and a range of light values. So I'll begin this sketch here by adding a black. Pick that up down here and add it over there like that. Then I'll add a middle value, and I'll pick up this middle value right there and add that over here like this. And then I'll add a light value, and I'll add this one right here to the sky area. Now, right now you can see that the light value has only one light value. The dark has only one dark value. The middle value has only one middle value. However, now I need to add other dark values within this dark value here. And I'll come over here where this dark range of values is and pick up a dark, but it'll be lighter than the black that I added. You see it right there. A lighter value, and then I'll pick up another dark, but this dark is even lighter than the one that I just put down, like this. So now my dark here contains not just one dark value, but a range of dark values. But it still reads basically as a dark seen against this middle value here and against this light value over here. Now to the middle value that you see right there, I'll add another middle value. I'll come over here and pick up this middle value and add that like that. And then another middle value. So what I've now established is a range of middle values. And for the sky here, I'll come over here and pick up the white and add that over here like this. And then I'll pick up this light value over here and add that to the top of the sky. That's the same value that I already have there. So I'll pick up another light value, this one right there, this one, and I'll add that. Now you see that there are more than just one light value in the sky here. There is a range of light values. But the picture or the value pattern still reads as basically a dark and middle value against a light value, even though I've added these other values. I went ahead and made a change by reducing the size of this foreground dark shape. It was a little too large in size and competing with the size of the light value shape of the sky here. All of the sizes for each of the value pattern shapes need to be of different size. This helps to add interest to the value pattern. So I'll do a little diagram here to make things even more clear, I think. Like this. Here's the dark, now just represented by this horizontal shape. Then there is the middle value, which is of an even smaller shape, like that. And then the light value shape of the sky. And here you can clearly see the differences in sizes, and that each value shape is of a different size. This is what you need to aim for in your value patterns. This kind of differences in sizes. Do not make the sizes the same. If you do, you'll wind up with a rather monotonous looking value pattern, which will make your painting look boring. Getting back to line, I'll just do a rough sketch here of a woman standing in shadow. And I'll skip ahead, show you what it looks like. I'm not going to do the whole sketch here because it just takes too long. And I want to focus on line. So here is the rough sketch. There are three kinds of line. One is in which the line looks like a line. So these look like lines. Then there is another kind of line, which is a compositional line, and it's called an implied line. And an implied line is set up by a shape, such as these bottles here, for example, that point in a particular direction. The bottles point upward, like that. Or it could be, let's say, another kind of object, which I'll just roughly sketch here. A teapot. It's a very quick sketch. Here's the spout. Now this teapot is pointing in this direction, toward the left. So it's setting up an implied line, a compositional line. Then there's another kind of line, which is called a psychological sight line. And if you look over where the figure is, right there, you can see that she's looking toward the left. The eye of the viewer looking at your picture will follow the direction in which the person is looking. With the implied line, the viewer of your picture will also follow the direction in which the object is pointing. So with the teapot, the eye moves toward the left in that direction in which the teapot is pointing. And the same with the bottles here. The eye of the viewer is being pointed upward, and therefore the eye is going to be led up. So you can control the eye of the viewer where the viewer is going to look within your composition through these three kinds of lines. Now, with the actual line here, you'll find shapes that are very narrow within a composition that can be looked upon as actual lines. Like, for example, this branch here, or this branch. These branches look like actual lines. So that's how they can be thought of. And then smaller branches or smaller lines like that. Now, you know that objects that are pointing in a certain direction set up an implied line that the eye of the viewer follows. But implied lines are not just set up by objects such as these bottles and that tea kettle that I drew earlier, but also by the edges of shapes. So therefore, this edge here of this painting is an implied line, as well as other edges like this edge and the edges of the folds here. These are all implied lines. And this edge. And the eye follows these implied lines of the edges of shapes. You can direct the viewer's attention where you want the eye of the viewer to be led to by way of these edges or implied lines found at the edges of shapes. This then means that you just can't haphazardly do your painting or drawing without thinking where the eye is being led by these implied lines of the edges of shapes. And if you don't plan these implied lines, then the eye will not know where to go, where it should be led to. So it will be following all sorts of edges that lead to places where you may not want the eye to go, because you're not controlling where the eye of the viewer is being led to. These kind of implied lines, as well as the psychological sight lines that I mentioned, are referred to as compositional lines. However, actual lines, like these here, for example, lines that look like real lines, can also be used within a composition to direct the viewer's eye around the composition. So when you have objects within your composition, such as these branches here that look like actual lines, those kind of objects direct the viewer's eye, like these branches directing the eye upward like that and toward the figure. So these implied lines here lead the eye like this, drawing the viewer's attention to this area here, which is next to her face. Therefore, when the eye is led here, it's also directed automatically up to the face, because a face draws a lot of attention. The viewer is going to want to look at the face. So even though these lines don't directly lead to her face, they lead near her face, and because of that, the eye is easily directed to the face to look at it. So you see, the eye is being directed by these implied lines. They have a purpose, and the purpose is to lead the eye to the center of interest, which is the face. They haven't been placed haphazardly all over the place without thinking about where these implied lines are leading the eye of the viewer. In addition to those implied lines, there are these actual lines that I pointed out to you earlier as leading the eye up toward the figure. So you see, all of these different lines, the actual lines and the implied lines, serve a purpose, and that is to move the eye of the viewer in the direction in which I want that eye to be led, which is toward the figure and the face, the center of interest. This is how you need to plan your compositions. You can see additional actual lines here. For example, these straps that are holding her dress together up here. These look like actual lines. And then right there, you see, there's an actual line. So I'm using actual lines in combination with implied lines, as well as the psychological sight line of her eyes looking toward the left. And now for the last element of design that I want to talk about, which is one of the most important, which is shape. You can't have an interesting picture without interesting shapes. And all shapes, no matter what the shape is, and there are literally a vast number of shapes in the world, different kinds of shapes. Tree shapes, a car shape, a boat shape, a train shape. Each shape enables you to recognize what that object is. The shape is the most telling aspect of an object in terms of being able to recognize what that object is. However, all shapes fall into three categories of shapes, and they are rectangular shapes, curving shapes, and angular shapes. It doesn't matter what the shape is. It's going to be one of these three kinds of shapes, or a combination of them. And these irregular shapes that I've drawn here actually stem from the geometric shapes of the square, the circle, and the triangle. These are your primary shapes, the basic shapes, from which these other ones, which are more irregular, are derived. And they're derived by stretching these basic shapes, distorting them, changing them in all sorts of ways to make them look more asymmetrical, more organic. Or you can have shapes that look more like the primary shapes, the actual geometric primary shapes. No matter what the shape is that you're drawing or painting, no matter how complex the shape may look, no matter how different it may look from these primary or basic shapes, it's going to reflect the basic character of one of these primary shapes. So therefore, this shape here reflects the rectangular character of the square. And this shape here, this curving shape, reflects the curving shape of the circle. And then the angular shape reflects the triangular character of the triangle shape. I'll be going over this again later on and in other lessons to remind you of this. It's very important that you remember it and apply it to your paintings. Therefore, it warrants repeating. I'm going to bring in the rough color sketch of that castle that I did. And here you can see one of these shapes, one of these categories of shapes. Can you recognize which one is dominant in this rough color sketch? Now, if you said the rectangular shape, you're right. And you can see that rectangular character of the shape here in these towers. And here. And here, like that. The overall shape, which is the big shape, in which the smaller shapes exist, that overall shape also has a rectangular character to it. You see that rectangular character? There are a couple of diagonals or oblique lines in there too, but you still get the feeling of a rectangular character to the shape. And always consider what the overall shape looks like. And an overall shape is then divided into a series of other shapes. Subdivisions occur. And these subdivisions also have that rectangular shape to them. To all of these rectangular shapes, I've introduced some contrasting shapes, some different shapes to add more interest to the picture. If you only have one kind of shape, then it's not as interesting as when you introduce some variety of shapes by way of contrasting shapes. Now, the contrasting shapes are both minor and major contrasting shapes, with the rectangular shapes. Here you see an angular or triangular shape, and here you see another one and another one over here. And right there, there's this triangular shape. Down here, there are triangular or angular shapes. Right here, there's an angular shape. Right here as well, angular shape. Another one over here. There's even a small one right there. And then here where the entrance is, I've introduced this curving shape. So these additional shapes, contrasting with the dominant rectangular shapes, help to add more interest to the picture than if only one kind of shape was used everywhere and no contrasting shapes introduced. As I mentioned, there are major and minor shape contrasts in this picture. The minor shape contrasts occur between the triangular or angular shapes and the rectangular shapes. The major contrast of shapes occurs between the circular shapes and the triangular or angular shapes as well as the rectangular shapes. When you combine rectangular shapes as represented by the square and angular shapes as represented by the triangle here, you're introducing minor shape contrasts because these two shapes have something in common. Whereas the circle and the square and the triangle have nothing in common. They are strong contrasting shapes. The circle is actually a discord when seen with these other two shapes. The square and the triangle both have straight lines, which gives them something that they have in common. But not only that, the triangle has a horizontal line, and the square also has a horizontal line. Now, where they contrast is, of course, that the triangle has an oblique edge or a diagonal to it, while the square does not. So, therefore, because these two shapes have more in common with each other than they do with the circle, they contrast less with each other than they do with the circle. I think I'm going to give you another example of the use of one of these shapes, and this time instead of the rectangular shape, I'll use the curving shape. So let me eliminate this sketch and bring in another one. This one you've already seen, but this time I'll show you the shapes that were used for this rough color sketch. And I'll change this to red. Right here, there's a curving shape. You can recognize it by the curve of the contour. And like this, up and around. There's a curving shape here for the fold. Another one here. Curving shape for her cape. Curving shape here. Right there. The contours have curves, making them curving shapes. Face is a curving shape. The hair. So you can see that the curving shapes are found throughout this sketch. Even the shapes found within the face have a curving shape to them, like this. Around the eyes and the mouth. I have all these curving shapes now, but I want to add some contrasting shapes to add even more interest to this picture. Like I said, it's best when you are able to introduce some contrasting shapes to the ones that dominate or predominate. And I could make her features more angular. However, then there's a danger that she may begin to look more like a man who has more angular features. So I have to be really careful. The more angular features would then contrast with the more curving shapes in other parts of the picture. Already, you can see that there's an angle here like that. And right here as well, right there. So it's like this. Angle, and then like that. So that turns into an angular shape. Make it a little more angular right there, like that. And then I've made the lips a bit more angular. And the nose, I'll make a little more angular. You see how angular it is right there? So now these angular features contrast with the curving shapes surrounding them. And that helps to draw attention to the face through contrast of shape. I'm going to enlarge this again and make some changes and some additions. I don't like the way this looks right there. Add a little light tone like that. And right here where the hair is, I can introduce more angular shapes. Something like this. You see how angular the shape is now? So the hair offers me an opportunity to introduce angular shapes in addition to the features. What I could do, in addition to those angular shapes found in her face and hair, I could add rectangular shapes by way of a brick wall that she's standing against. So, just roughly suggesting these bricks here like this. Now, I'm not going to draw all the bricks, so what I'll do is I'll jump ahead and show you what that brick wall looks like with those rectangular shapes in back of her. And there you go. Not only are there these rectangular shapes of the bricks contrasting with the foreground curving shapes of the figure, but there's also the introduction of an angular shape right there. You see it right here. And a small one right there, providing additional contrast of shape to add even more interest to the picture. However, you need to be careful when introducing additional contrasting shapes so that they do not compete with the dominating or predominating shapes. They need to remain fewer in number or smaller than the dominating shapes. Otherwise, if they are of the same number of shapes as the dominating shapes, or of the same size or very similar, then you have this competition between the different shapes in your composition, and you won't have a dominant shape. And when you don't have a dominant shape, you don't have unity of shape. Unity of shape is achieved through dominance of shape. So one kind of shape needs to dominate. And here, the curving shapes, I think, still dominate over these other contrasting shapes that have been added. What I could do, in addition to those angular shapes found in her face and hair, I could add rectangular shapes by way of a brick wall that she's standing against. So, just roughly suggesting these bricks here like this. I'm not going to draw all the bricks, so what I'll do is I'll jump ahead and show you what that brick wall looks like with those rectangular shapes in back of her. And there you go. Not only are there these rectangular shapes of the bricks contrasting with the foreground curving shapes of the figure, but there's also the introduction of an angular shape right there. You see it right here. And a small one right there, providing additional contrast of shape to add even more interest to the picture. However, you need to be careful when introducing additional contrasting shapes so that they do not compete with the dominating or predominating shapes. They need to remain fewer in number or smaller than the dominating shapes. Otherwise, if they are of the same number of shapes as the dominating shapes, or of the same size or very similar, then you have this competition between the different shapes in your composition, and you won't have a dominant shape. And when you don't have a dominant shape, you don't have unity of shape. Unity of shape is achieved through dominance of shape. So one kind of shape needs to dominate. And here, the curving shapes still dominate over these other contrasting shapes that have been added.